Good afternoon. We apologize for the delay. We had some technical difficulty. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Hard Deals Require Soft Skills. Never underestimate the cultural dimension before and after and during a deal. My name is Richard Martin. I'm the Chief Business Officer of Mergerware, and I will be your host today for our webinar. Culture eats strategy for breakfast is a phrase originated by Peter Drucker, so don't leave it unattended. This is very true, as M&A is not only about financial techniques, but they're about the people behind the deals on both the buy and the sell sides. Culture is very important in both the assessment and negotiations, where style, pace, and time are key, and during the integration phase, where you must pay attention to cultural references and reactions. During this webinar, we will learn more about how culture can impact negotiation, how it can impact post-merger integration, and the other soft skills required to focus on during an M&A transaction. To help us get through this all, we are very lucky to have Peter Harbula, who is the Executive Director of Corporate Finance of the Edenred Group. Peter oversees end-to-end execution of M&A transactions, joint venture creations, investment decisions, and valuations, and he's worked on more than 40 successfully executed transactions since joining Edenred in 2007. Peter spent 8 years prior to that at Deloitte's financial valuations team and has executed many deals there as well. He is an accredited senior appraiser of the American Society of Appraisers and a member of the French Association of M&A Professionals. As you can tell, Peter is highly experienced, and we are very fortunate to have him with us today to share some of his best practices. So Peter, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thanks, Richard. So hello, everyone. First of all, I'm delighted to be with you today and speak about my experience. And thank you very much, Mergerware, for giving me the opportunity to speak about a topic which is very dear for me, because I do believe that we often underestimate the role of culture in M&A operations in general. I had the opportunity to do a number of transactions, especially through my time with Edenred, in 4 continents, almost 30 countries. So I had my share of what we call international or cross-border M&A. So what I'm going to go over with you today is basically two topics. First, speak about a little bit about negotiations and how culture can impact negotiations. Obviously, it's a very interesting topic about style, pace, timing, and also speak a little bit about how culture can have an impact on the integration process, which we often neglect, but it is as important in doing M&A deals as it is doing a good negotiation or a good, I would say, a discussion about price and similar terms. So if we move into the presentation, why do I believe it's very important to speak about culture? First of all, even in M&A, we are only people, and M&A in special is an interaction between human beings. We often think of M&A as hard discussions, Excel files, valuation, but a large part of the interaction is people around the table, discovering what different people wants to achieve and what wants to do together. And actually, the more we move into smaller transactions, small and mid-cap deals, the more we will find that discussions may or may not be completely rational. Emotions play our part, and obviously culture and emotion are quite deeply related. At Edenred, this is, I would say, a key area for us. First of all, most of the transactions I have been executed for Edenred fall between the small and mid-cap size of deals. Obviously, we also did some large transactions in the past, but the bulk of the deals are within what we call the small and mid-cap transactions. And for these transactions, often you have not only advisors around the table, but the founder, the manager, the creator of the company, and they have especially different reaction and culture can come into play a lot. Second, Edenred, we are a company where people are one of our core assets. So whenever we do M&A transactions, a focus on the people, on their integration, and basically what's the footprint we left in them during the initial phase of M&A approach is quite critical. So let's do a little review of what is culture. I think culture is basically a common set of implicit values, beliefs, and assumptions that has an impact on how people behave in a company or in society in general. Very interesting to see that people who share the same culture often don't really recognize, because they feel it's implicit, it's natural. We all have our own natural culture and an environment in which we like to behave. And it's a challenge to recognize that there are set patterns which govern our day-to-day interactions. So it requires some, I would say, some kind of rational step back whenever we enter into discussion, to realize that the way we interact in different situations, the way we behave, the way we discuss, the way we react, the way we play in negotiations in something which is inherent to who we are, but the other part will not necessarily have the same reactions, the same reading. So what we, because of our culture, interpret in a way may or may not have a different meaning for our counterpart. Second, because we are raised in a certain way, obviously culture is very resilient, and people do take a long time to adapt into different culture, different I would say environments. But basically over our life, we are influenced very strongly on the culture in which we have been raised. I would say I have the ability to see that because personally I have lived my childhood in 2 different European countries, and whenever I had to switch from one to the other in school, you know, simple things, at university, if I applied references from the other country, the other set of culture, I was often not understood, or my behavior was seen completely differently by my teachers, my roommates, classmates, even my friends. Last point, people feel comfortable in their own cultural environment, and whenever we try to impose on them something new, it's not easy, because they have to acknowledge these new rules, values, beliefs that we ask them to do, and be able to imply and to use them in the long run. Obviously, and we all know that the countries do have a different culture, and typically in negotiations, generally speaking, but obviously also in M&A transactions, mismatch of culture, mismatch of reading behaviors is something that can cause critical problem, misunderstanding, a transaction never happening. Hence, one of the learnings I had over the last, I would say, 10 plus years in M&A, almost 20, is never to underestimate the cultural and the personal dimension in any discussions, and soft skill are really important whenever you want to make sure that a transaction is happening the right way, and the way actually you want it to happen. To give an example, quite obvious, but I think it's always good to remember, the role of women counterparts is not seen the same in Europe, in Middle East, in Far East, or in what we call the Western world in general. Typically, in the same way as we have countries where team members who are quite junior can participate and share their opinion or beliefs or observation within a debate, and it's normal. So I would say the pyramid is very lean. There are cultures, typically in the Far East, where seniority is very important, and the way you interact is between equals. Hence, junior members of the teams don't or cannot play the same role in a negotiation and as in Europe or in the US, for instance. So typically, the way to approach this, and this is a recurring theme where I will come back during the presentation, is that you need to adapt, prepare in advance, and be in a situation where you very simply recognize which cultural context you will enter into, and how and when. How do you prepare? Sorry, how do you prepare for that? How to adapt the team? How to adapt your behavior to the context, which is going to be key. Again, a few examples of how culture and negotiation and cultural barriers can impact negotiations. I'm sure you all know that saying no has not the same meaning in Europe, in the US, or in Asia. There are cultures which clearly are known to avoid confrontation. So, but they never say no, right? Because it's a loss of face. It's a situation which is uncomfortable in their native cultural environment. So, replying, I will think about it. Let me think of it. It's not easy. It's difficult, which for us sometimes in Western Europe means, okay, he will think of it. Maybe it's possible. In their cultural reference, it's a no. But if we are not able to recognize this, if you're not able to think of it, then obviously we are completely misunderstanding the messages that are being sent in that context. So this is why it's important, because the cultural barriers that exist, which are natural in the world, if not interpreted appropriately, will be completely misread. I give here also another example, which is nepotism. So having someone from the family or relatives working in a company. There are countries where it is completely abnormal. That's seen as a bad practice. It's maybe regarded as unethical even. Whereas in other culture, because of the cultural framework, it's completely normal that your family, your relatives are trustworthy employees, those who can actually trust with the key items. If we move to an example, this is I would say a website that you can consult, and that gives you an idea about how to, I would say, look at different cultures during across the world. It's not the best source. It's a source that I like a lot because I do believe it gives you a good way to try to characterize cultural specificities in different countries. So here I took the example of Hungary, which is an example I have not chosen by hazard because I'm Hungarian. I was born in Hungary. So typically Hungary would be considered, and I do believe it's quite true actually, a rather competitive environment, especially since the Berlin Wall has came down. People became quite individualist. There is a strict preference for the short term, especially when it comes to financial terms. In general, people are able to make a relatively good balance between short and long-term requirements. But when it comes to money, it's rather show me the money first, and then we can discuss about things. As most cultures in Eastern Europe, Hungary has a strong tendency for cynicism and pessimism. It's obviously related to history of the country, which I will not dwell into here because for a country that has been, under power of foreign empires for 500 years, it's natural things to evolve. Hungarians are people that are proud of their independence and love to fight for such independence, again, for historical reason. And for the same reason, they love to feel different and than the rest of the world. So you see, just by looking at the history of a country and where the country comes from and what has been the last 100, 200 years, you can understand a lot about why culture evolved the way it evolved. Hence, you can make some good, I would say, inference about how the culture is going to be and understand how people are going to behave in negotiations. Let's look at another, I would say, a framework to try to look at cultures. This is from the study from EISC professors. I think it's quite simplified, but if you look at a very simple way to look at culture, I really found this as an excellent way to characterize culture. So basically, you can categorize culture by 3 criteria: honor, faith, and dignity. I would say in the Western world, so Europe and US, we have a country we are countries which are based on dignity. Dignity means that we look for in negotiations and strategies for the so-called win-win scenarios. First of all, that means that when we discuss with people, that's not personal, it's business. So whatever stance we take, whatever arguments we advance, we're doing it for business reason, but we're not considering as a personal attack for us. As opposed to cultures which are based on honor or on faith, such as Asia, which is considered as a faith culture in general, or Latin America, which is considered an honor, where personal relationships, well, the famous saving the face expressions are much more important. As an instance, for in faith countries, it's very important to show humility, respect of the counterparts, and that all discussions are rather harmonious. In some countries, typically, I would say it's the case in Latin America, trust is very important, and it's also the case in Asia, but I just take the example of LATAM. So establishing a trustful relationship is quite critical whenever you start discussion in these countries. And I'll come back to examples if you look at a few countries which I chose to discuss. So another way to say the same is that basically in a country which is based on faith or on honor, people react to the way they are seen in the eyes of others. And it's very important that in a discussion, it's your own self-worth which is being, let's say, judged, as opposed to, I would say, in culture about dignity, it's really the people who see themselves through their own eyes and do not care a lot about the way they are being observed by the others. So these are countries which are more individualistic, we know that. Hence, again, taking harsh stances, making strong sentences or a heated debate is not considered necessarily a personal issue, it's considered business as usual. Why is that important? Basically, if we are facing honor, faith, or dignity-based countries, it's very important to understand what is at stake when the discussion is being done. In a faith or a honor-based country, the stakes are different. It's the person, the man or the woman, who is doing the discussion that has its personal reputation at stake. A transaction that fails in these countries is seen as a personal failure, a personal outcome, okay? Obviously, in dignity cultures, as I told many times in the last 2 minutes, it's not personal. So it's not your personal failure if a transaction doesn't go to the end. It is what it is, but you are not seen personally responsible. to make an analogy, I would say in dignity culture, it's you play with the cards that you have been dealt with, and if you can't make it work, that because maybe you didn't have the best cards, as opposed to other cultures where it's really personal. So any failure is a personal failure. So a few examples. I'll try not to go into too much, generalities, but this is just my personal experience. So I try to share with you what I had been the luck and the privilege to discover over the different deals I had the chance to make over the last 10 plus years. Obviously, we know that in the US, which is atypically a signature culture, people usually work for a win-win scenario. Discussion tends to be very constructive. Discussions are based on figures and facts. I think it's very important that the more factual you are in any arguments you advance, the more, I would say, easy the discussion will be. But it's also true to say that Americans are also, human beings and people. So they care for soft items in discussions, especially entrepreneurs. I think entrepreneurs in general are a subset of the population that have a very strong emotional attachment to the company they have created. So in addition to the facts and the figures, the way you recognize and respect their achievement can make a difference in the outcome of negotiations. I had the experience in the US that an entrepreneur chose not the company, so not the offer which was financially the best, the highest, but a slightly lower bid, because he believed that that buyer with a slightly lower bid was the best harbor for his ship. Sorry. South America. In South America, you have a lot of stakes which are related to building trust and confidence in negotiations. Never underestimate the opportunity to get to know people, to establish personal relations, dinners, lunches, informal events, informal way of doing things. I often laugh about this, but in some countries, the key part of discussions are not done, in the formal discussion around the table, but in side discussions. I had once with the privilege to being invited to a very large barbecue party in a South American country, where basically we dealt with the 3 critical points of the negotiations instead of doing that in a negotiation rooms with lawyers. And one item which is really important in Latin America, because it's a honor-based culture, is the importance of the commitment, giving the word. So I had the chance to experience that a few times, that for most people in Latin America, once they give their word and agree to something, they are able to respect that word, regardless of what has been, or what will be written down in subsequent steps of a process. So in this case, we were discussing with a party. We came over to visit. We had an informal lunch where we sat down. We agreed on a few items. We shook hands on those items. And then for the next 3 months, while we were not even under exclusivity discussing key terms of the deal, he refused, as he gave us his word, to acknowledge any call or any attempt for other parties to offer better terms in the discussions, because he gave his word to us that he would strike a deal on the terms we agreed. And as long as we kept our part of the bargain and didn't change these terms, he kept his word as well, and refused to acknowledge even a phone call. If you go a little bit around the world and land in Russia, obviously it's a little different style. First of all, we all know that Russian people are very strong in chess, and I really can testify that any negotiations with them is basically like a chess strategy. So they do plan ahead for a lot of moves, but more importantly, the style is much more confrontational. Discussions are more heated. There are more emotions involved, and they don't necessarily look for a win-win solution. They want to win, so they need a victor, and they will push until they need a victor. Again, it's part of the culture, and especially the way the country has changed over the last almost 20 years, 30 years, sorry, since the fall of the USSR. You know that in Russia, wealth and power are important. So even showing off wealth and power, things which we'll not necessarily do in other parts of the world, or we don't see that as really elegant. For them, it's normal, and it's part to establish who you are. If I try to take a completely different angle and look at a different part of the world, which is Scandinavia, in Scandinavia, discussions are very, I would say, straightforward, simple, fact-based, quick, decisive, and Scandinavian parties have a very strong sense of ethics when it comes to the way they discuss and also the way they run their businesses. And it's something, it's culturally very important for them, and it's something which will span every type of discussion that you will have in this part of the world. I'm looking now at China. Again, China is a quite specific country in Asia with should I say, a special role in many items of discussions. First of all, we know that time in China is seen differently than in other parts of the world, so they take their time for different discussions. It's a culture which avoid direct conflict as much as possible. So even a yes doesn't really mean that they agree. It can also be a subtle form to state a negative or an uncertain position. Negotiations tend to be quite crowded with a lot of people. We know that the elderly are very well respected in China because of Confucianism, which means that in a discussion, seniority is very important. They will try to match as closely as possible the seniority of the people that you bring on your side. So the more senior the people are on your side, the more senior the people will be on their side, and vice versa. The more junior you are, the less senior people will be in the room, which may be an issue because sometimes the parties in the room do not have the authority to take decisions. So the decision process may be quite longer than we're used to see in other parts of the world. Items agreed in a discussion may be retracted afterwards because they actually had not the power to agree to certain points. Loyalty is very important. So they are very loyal to their employer and to the people they work with. And having said that, I will say a strong caveat here because as culture evolves and as China opens more and more to the rest of the world, and as China, there are more and more Chinese people who are educated in Western universities in the US or in Europe. Actually, their behavior changed a lot as well. And it's never easy to know whether the change is only in the surface, just to feel and to make you comfortable, whether it's a deep change and they are able to match the same cultural references that you have in your own culture. It's definitely China is different, and negotiation in China are different now than they were probably 20 years ago. but you never know how deep the change has actually been. Japan is quite similar to China. Again, we have a culture which will avoid direct conflict. Time maybe moves more quicker than in China, but in the meetings you have very long silences. Silence is basically part of the discussion. It's a way for them to think and you know, to test your impatience. Japanese people are also very patient. They have a very strong requirement for being respectful and humble. So the face is really an issue. Loyalty is very key as well. And you know, there are the things which are inherent to Japanese culture, which we see as very strong. To give you an example, auditors have a completely different role in Japan than they have in the US or in Western Europe. Basically, an accountant in Japan, and I'm oversimplifying things just to give the example, but an accountant will not cheat. He may make a mistake, but it's a mistake. There is no need to verify his work because he will do the best as he can. Also in discussion, Japanese people may actually not decide in meetings, retract, and offer to go back and refer to third parties before taking a commitment. Moving now to Middle East, which obviously is a very interesting culture as well. Trust needs to be established like in Latin America. Wealth and power are very important in the Middle East as well. They would not hesitate to show off their own power and their own wealth, which is fine because it's their cultural reference. They want to discuss with people who have the right to make decisions. You need to be empowered to be I would say meaningful in discussions, and they respect a lot of power. To give you an anecdote on this, I do remember that when I came once to have a discussion, first time in my life in the Middle East, I went into a meeting, we introduced ourselves, and basically I wanted to start the meeting, and they looked at me strangely. You know, I took out my pen and said, okay, I have a few questions for you. So they looked at me with a little shock, and this is when I realized, no, we need to take the first hour to establish personally who we are, why we are here. And once we had that introductory phase that can take quite a long, then only can we go down into business. Sorry. Moving on to Europe, I think it's very difficult to draw up a map of Europe. Europe is all but a consistent set of culture. It's, you know, there are a number of different countries in Europe, and each of them has a different style. Typically, UK would be probably what is the closest to the US, whereas in Eastern Europe, that has been because these countries have been marked by good 40+ years of communism. The cultural references, the behaviors are obviously very different than in Western Europe. Money is important for everyone, but quick money is more important in Eastern Europe, whereas Western Europeans could take a longer stance in certain situations. The more you go to the south, the more personal relations are important. Time definition becomes less strict, and things move to more and more informal discussions. So obviously it's difficult to tell you should do this, that exactly, because it depends on which culture you come from and which culture you're heading into. I think the most important, which I try to emphasize with my colleagues in entering discussions is prepare yourself, do your homework on the culture of the country that you are going to deal with. Be respectful of the cultural differences. One culture is not better than the other. They are just different. So recognize the differences, but don't believe that you are superior or inferior. Actually, you're just different. Not easy, but try to recognize that people behave differently because of their different cultures. So even if it may be insulting for you, it may be not insulting for them. So before having a strong reaction, try to think, because maybe there is a second, more subtle meaning to it that you think or you thought. And obviously, you need to work to try to bridge the cultural gap. I would say generally, it's over the last 20 years, we know that countries are opening up more and more. People move more and more around. The people we meet in M&A discussions are actually the more educated, usually people. So they have university degrees, they even traveled a little bit, they have studied potentially in other universities, other cultures. So it's true that the frontiers blur a little bit these days, but again, culture is resilient. So even if someone has studied for a year in the US, it will just maybe help you that he has a decent English, but it doesn't mean that the cultural references has fundamentally changed, especially if that person returned to his home environment. I'm moving to a different section now, which is not culture anymore, but the different soft skills which may or may not be required when you deal with SMEs, and especially because in those transactions you have a very particular player or counterpart that comes into the play, and that's the seller, who is usually the manager or the founder or the founder of the company. And as you may imagine, a founder has a very different emotional relationship to his company as opposed to a typical professional manager who is not the founder or the shareholder of the company. The more and more you go into SMEs, so small and mid-sized enterprises, the more and more likely it will be that you will not find yourselves against professional managers, or not only professional managers, but also people who are basically the founders, the creators of the company, which would mean that the emotional attachment is very important. In an M&A process, he's selling his lifetime's work, a lifetime's work of which he usually is very proud of. He may even not be completely rational in the decisions that he makes. Sometimes it's very difficult for them to let go of their company. So deals may take a long time to materialize or to happen, longer than in a typical auction bid where processes are set up and there are strict timelines which are followed. Negotiations will take longer, but this is also the beauty part, because as the negotiation take longer, you will have the opportunity to be much more creative in the solutions. That's also a pitfall. Sometimes you try to be too creative because you have specific situations and you want to be able to solve it to the best you can. So, as always, keeping it simple, as simple as possible, is a good reference point in the discussion. I would say 2 key points when you are discussing with sellers who are founders. Obviously, trust is very important. I know that at Edenred, one of the key assets we have in M&A discussions is our reputation. And the reputation we have built as trustful partners in M&A and reliable partners over the last decades. And also because you are dealing with someone who is very emotional to the asset he is selling, you need to be able to be at the same time very empathic but firm and on the key negotiation points that are important to you. And maybe you will need to spend more time than usual to understanding the key points, the rationale, the logic behind the different requests that you may encounter. So clearly, founders may not act as rationally as professional managers because they have an emotional attachment. They are human beings, it's normal. So, it's the way a founder will react to a deal will be a mix of his personality, his culture. So for culture, it's easy because we can prepare in advance. The personality is not something that you can prepare in advance. It's something that you will discover along the discussions. And you will need to adapt your negotiation style and negotiation strategy to the people that you are facing. Someone who is prone probably to have to be more impulsive, to be entrenched in some key points, key fears, key desires that he has, and the very difficult job that is at hand in this situation is to be able to explain and to go around these entrenchments. So one of the advice I would say on this is the most pedagogic we can be in explaining processes, steps, how M&A works is very important. Usually SMEs are sold in non-intermediated deals, so there is no M&A advisor between you and the seller. So internal team of large corporates have to basically take the role of explaining in a very simple, honest, and pragmatic way how M&A transactions happen to people who are not used to it. So it's about processes, it's about setting the pace, it's about rules. And the more you are fair to the seller in explaining pros and cons on different options, the more trust you will establish and the more easier the things will become afterwards if you move down the process in different steps. I'm moving now to I would say, the third part of the presentation, which is about culture and integration. As always joke internally with the business units that I do have actually the easiest role in M&A transactions because it's easy to do deals, relatively easy, at least. It's a joke, obviously. We know it's hard, but let's say it's easy to do deals. But once a deal is over and we stroke a deal, actually it's time to do a good integration. So making a deal is easy. Doing a good integration and delivering is the hard job. And obviously in the M&A team, we do have a strong role in PMI, but we are less hands-on into this as we were, negotiating and striking the deal. And as we said in introduction, as Richard mentioned it, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if you are not mindful of the culture of the company you are buying and how this culture, regardless of how big or small the company may be, how such culture will interact with your own company culture, if you're not able to understand in advance how this will happen, you are bound to fail. And we will see in the charts afterwards that cultural mismatch is one of the key reasons why M&A deals fails. And we all heard that one of the key reasons why M&A transactions fail afterwards is not because the company was paid at the wrong price, it's because integration has not been executed properly. So just to give you 3 pillars of the of the best practices we at Edenred have for integration. First of all, it's important to have a handbook of references and processes, how you want to make integration. That's number one. Number two, there needs to be a deal handover between the deal team and the operational teams. So the operational teams need to come in at the end of the process and start getting some familiarity with what the terms that are being negotiated, especially that many of those terms are actually being negotiated at their request. But the M&A team cannot step out completely once transaction has been done. The M&A team needs to maintain a light but eye presence to make sure that there is a proper handover. Finally, there needs to be a follow-up after the deal. So if we negotiated items, it's the role of either the M&A team or a dedicated PMI organization to make sure with dedicated follow-ups that the things which we agreed to in the course of the negotiations will be followed up afterwards to make sure that the deal memory doesn't fade away. Finally, and it's not a pillar, but I think it's just a good advice. It's never be too shy to ask for help. I think the more complicated integration becomes, the more important it is that people, if necessary at the right time, raise their hand and do ask for help, because there are excellent professionals also in consulting firms that can make sure that your integration and your PMI is a success. To give you a few examples, this is an extractable study from PwC, and the question was, which are the most difficult items in integrating M&A deals? Obviously, in number one, we find people and organization, which means implicitly culture. And we find systems and process integration only at the second. So as you can see, if you try to apply your own set of references to any environment without being mindful of who the people are in the organization, how they organize themselves, and what the systems and processes are, you are doomed to go to failure. So whenever you plan your PMI, it's something that you need to understand in advance to make sure you come up with the best tailor-made PMI approach. Moving to another chart, which this time comes from Aon Hewitt. Again, deal failures, top 10 drivers of deal failures. What do we find in number one place? Called implementation took longer. Why did implementation took longer? Number two, because of cultural issues. And if you speak about price, because often we say, we overpaid this company, it wasn't worth that much. We find this argument, we find it, but it's number 9 in the table. It's 20% of respondents who said that. So you see, culture and the impact that culture integration has on the different integration process are basically the two key reasons that people afterwards recognized as the clear reasons to failure. Another way to say it is that we don't overpay so much targets, we just execute integration poorly. Another chart, still from the Aon Hewitt studies. So as you can see, we see consequences of successful cultural integration. We lose people, we don't achieve synergies or some of the critical milestones, and basically the organization in general is becoming much more productive. There's distractions because we do not, I would say, concentrate on critical items. Another way to say it is basically we fail to deliver the business plan. So typically, whenever we do a PMI approach within Edenred, we try to identify the critical path points of integration around culture to make sure that even if we have difficulties, at least they don't come from the cultural issues, but they come from different points. If you look also at the chart on the right side, which is items that contribute to unsuccessful integration, you see that the first two items that basically lead to unsuccessful integration in terms of culture are either we didn't understand the company's culture in due diligence, or we were unable to agree internally on the leadership that we desire in the future. Again, this is coming from surveys that involved a lot of people. So obviously, it reflects view of many people, many transactions. Again, we find culture either pre-transactions in the due diligence phase, or in delivering the right culture for the right PMI as one of the two critical reasons which explain failed M&A. So, what impact will culture have on PMI? I would say there are obviously 4 critical impacts you can see. It's about how quickly you are able to make decisions. In different cultures, the speed at which we advance and the time we spend on taking decision is not the same. It's about leadership style. There are companies where leadership is more, I would say, clear, and orders are sent from the top to the down. There are organizations where leadership is more consultative or diffuse, if you want, and people, if they don't recognize that the change is going to happen, will react to it quite negatively. Maybe they will not tolerate it, which obviously will lead either into turnover or at least into a cultural inefficiency. Number 3, not all culture have the same ability to adapt to new environment and to change. So they are cultures which very easily blend into new cultures, understand, adapt, and function and thrive within the new organization or the new culture. They are cultures which have quite rigid set of beliefs and values, and you need to be very mindful of that and plan your integration step by step, very carefully for that. So how can we address it in PMI? I would say, as already discussed, first of all, you need to be able to identify culture as much as possible as a critical factor in PMI. You need to have someone who will own this corporate culture in the target and report it into the senior management throughout the process with regular reporting all the time. You try to understand what are the tangible and intangible items of culture, how they work, and make sure that any integration process, any steering committee understand that. If possible, with factual example, that's always better than just being in general observations. As I said, one culture is not better than the other. So whenever culture emerge, it's important to try to take the best of both worlds and the strength, and not take over obviously weaknesses, but try to see how you can blend the good parts of different company cultures into something which is even better. You need to be cognizant of the decision-making process and its interaction with culture. In some countries, decision is very quick and simple. Other cultures, it will be longer and more cumbersome, involving more or less people. You need to be able to recognize that and to blend that into the PMI process that you will put in place. And finally, never forget that this is about people. So it's very important that you recognize how people will be able to blend and fit into the PMI, and how to retain the key employees, which obviously will be critical to delivering the business plan in the future. So, as a conclusion, I would say, as we have seen in the past few slides, soft skills are very important, almost as important as hard technical skills on M&A deals, especially if we look at smaller size transactions, especially if you look at cross-border transactions, regardless of the size, especially if you are in a situation where you are a founder manager involved in discussions. The cultural aspects can be thought of in advance of any, I would say, M&A process, and your negotiation style, your approach, the process needs to be adaptive of what the culture is of the target and how your role cultures are and how you are going to bridge the differences. And finally, be always mindful that the way you react to certain, I would say, words, behaviors, are not necessarily the I would say, meaningful versus the initial intent, because there are cultural breaks. So there are cultural bridges that you need to build, so that whenever you think of some cultural reference is not necessarily what has been intended by the other party. Another way to say it is that we are each responsible for 50% of any interaction between people. But when you receive the other 50% of the other party, you must be, I would say, cognizant enough to be able to take a step back and recognize that that what the message that you perceive at first is not necessarily the message which has been intended, and that's true in M&A, striking the deal, but it's also true in the PMI process post M&A, which means in the integration phase. So I hand over now to Richard, who will share with us a few items.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. That was very, very insightful and helpful information. I think, as you noted, it's not only useful during the M&A and PMI process, but I think that's information that will be particularly useful in life, as you want to have more successful integrations in a more connected world. So thank you for that. Very briefly, I'd like to mention a little bit about Mergerware. We are an expert digital M&A consultancy who have revolutionized the M&A process by bringing together over 100 years of deal-making experience with advanced, easy-to-use technology that helps organizations achieve the best possible outcomes from their M&A transactions. We provide the expertise and the tools that bring out the best in your teams. Hit the next slide, please. Now, many M&A experts we talk to expressed concern about properly executing their business plans during a transaction, and they've highlighted the challenges they face while working to achieve the stated synergy goals of the transaction and to maintain the integration momentum over the long term. We also talk to people like integration managers that who have a primary worry about their ability to efficiently engage and the appropriate teams at the right time. Talking about culture, and track those teams' progress and ensure that risks and issues are identified early and mitigated. If any of these areas are of concern to you, or if you have any interest in learning more about Mergerware, I invite you to visit our website, mergerware.com, or you can contact me directly. My details are in the presentation. So again, Peter, I wanted to thank you. I think this was very valuable information, and I hope the audience enjoyed it and learned something. Thank you for your time and sharing your expertise with us today. And I want to thank the audience for taking time out of their day to join us, and hopefully you have some good takeaways. We will distribute the presentation as well, so you'll have all the details there. And so this ends our webinar. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon and a good evening.
Thank you, Richard. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.